I'm Leandra Lederman, and it's time to break into law reviews. I'm really pleased to co-host today a conversation with our student expert, who's an executive articles editor at the Indiana University Maurer School of Law.
I'm John Choi, co-hosting today. I'm an associate professor at the University of Minnesota Law School.
Hi, I'm Abbi Semnisky. I'm a 3L at the Indiana University Maurer School of Law, and I was the executive articles editor for volume 97 of the Indiana Law Journal.
We often hear about how law reviews are just flooded with submissions. So one of the tricks is to get your article pulled out of the pile. Let's start with just how many submissions law reviews get.
The folks at the Minnesota Law Review were generous enough to share some statistics about the number and timing of submissions, and I was really surprised. So this past year, in February 2021, they got a total of 1,585 submissions, and of those, 475 arrived on the very first day that they opened up for submissions on Scholastica, which is February 15th. So about 30% of all the submissions arrived on the very first day. 1,270 were received in the month of February, and then 315, so only about 20% were received in March. And then by the end of March, the Minnesota Law Review had closed for new submissions.
So ILJ has pretty similar statistics. On my first day, we had about 600 submissions in our inbox, and we continued to accept them until we filled up mid-March. ILJ typically opens up submissions the day the new EAE is elected, which is typically in mid-February. And we're looking to have that again this year, and we hit the ground running from there.
So when you say you filled up in mid-March, was that filling all of the books for the year?
Mm-hmm.
So you did not actually have an August submission cycle?
No, ILJ does not have an August submission cycle. We fill our entire volume in the spring submission cycle.
What's interesting is that both the Minnesota Law Review and it sounds like the Indiana Law Journal fill up their entire volume in the spring cycle, so they don't take any articles in the summer cycle. And my sense is that's increasingly where law reviews are going. Abbi, I'd be curious to hear why you think that is.
We work to do issue slating right after we finish filling up our volume, and that kind of sets up everything for the next year. So it gives us the summer to do the summer read-throughs, connect each of our executive members with their assigned author, and gives us time to do a lot of work over the summer. We really value that time.
So that's really interesting because I've always wondered if there's a supply and demand question. A lot of professors finish their writing at the end of the summer and are ready to submit, but there are fewer law journal spots. So it sounds like there's actually a kind of structural production reason why law journals wouldn't just open up more slots in the summer to get those great articles that have just been finished.
Yeah, the other part about the August cycle is that it has traditionally been regarded also as something of a free bite at the apple. Because the idea is if you submit in August and the piece doesn't place, you could resubmit it in the spring cycle and you're going to have different student editors reading the piece, whereas the other way around doesn't hold. So I think it's also possible that there were more of the less polished pieces being submitted in August.
One thing for ILJ too is while we do finish up our entire current volume in the spring submission cycle, our editors are still open to accepting symposium pieces. So if you did not place in the spring, but you are looking to be part of a symposium and you present that, we are looking at those throughout the year for our next volume.
Oh, that's interesting. So someone at another school could propose a symposium topic.
Yes. So we typically like to have the symposium brought to us with all the authors together and proposals of the pieces, but we are open to talking about that after our submission cycle closes. From the entire time our journal has been using Scholastica, we accept about 5% of the articles submitted to us, and we have about a 2/3 acceptance rate of authors accepting our offers.
Minnesota is pretty similar. In the spring 2021 cycle, about 2% of the submissions were accepted, and about 2/3 of those who were offered publication accepted.
Abbi, could you walk us through the process? Like, what's the pipeline to eventual acceptance?
Pay attention to where the law review is asking for submissions. For example, ILJ only accepts submissions through Scholastica, so we don't look at one sent through email. So pay attention to the mediums you're sending them through. When I get an article in my inbox, I will typically look at the abstract. And if it's something that we have room for in that volume and it looks interesting and like it'd be a good fit for us, I then assign it to an editor to do a read through. The editor will give a rating and a thorough review of it. I will take a look at that editor's review and see if we want to push it forward to another editor. And we typically have a few reads from there. And based on my editor's reviews, I will then take a thorough look at the article and determine whether I would like to make an offer or not. And sometimes in that process, I will reach out to other professors, ask their opinions, and then from there we go to the offer process.
An accepted article would have been read by how many people total? Generally?
No less than 4.
Let's talk about how you get your article pulled out of the pile. One thing we should say with all of this is your mileage may vary depending on what your field of specialty is, what type of articles you write, and also, frankly, what school you're at and how senior you are. So, Abbi, what part of the submission do you find that you generally look at first in order to screen articles?
The first thing I look at when I'm combing through the articles to determine what we want to look further into is the abstract. And I think one really important thing about the abstract is setting up for your audience. And your audience is student editors who aren't necessarily experts in a particular field of law. And while something is so interesting and it's a really popular topic in that field of law, we don't always know that. So setting up in your abstract what you're talking about, why it's important and why it's novel can be really helpful to help your article get picked out.
And I actually think this is advice, not just for getting your article published in a prestigious journal, but also in terms of what people will actually read. Most people don't have the time to read an entire article. They'll just read the abstract, or they'll just read the introduction. So making it as polished as possible is always great advice. I probably revise my abstracts 30 times before I publish an article, whereas the rest of the body of the article I might read only 5 or 6 times.
And one helpful thing with that too is talking with your school's articles editors. I had a professor approach me, ask me to look at her article and her abstract and see how a student editor would respond to it. I gave her some suggestions on moving some of the interesting points higher up, and she placed really well last cycle.
Abbi, when you're looking at abstracts, are you looking for particular topics? Like, do you have a quota of, well, we're only publishing so many on this topic, or other ways in which you're screening articles besides knowing that the topic seems interesting and relevant?
So I think that's a bit of a complex issue, and each executive articles editor has the discretion to take on as many or little of each topic as they choose. So IOJ likes to have a pretty diverse range of topics. We will take more than one of each topic, but we try and kind of cap it at a small number so we can continue to have a broad range of literature in our publication.
There's a perception that certain topics are harder to publish in, and Leandra and I are both tax scholars, and tax is one of those. I do think it is possible, though, and the trick is just what Abbi was saying. I mean, to make your ideas clear, and especially to make it clear why people should care about it. In tax, there are things that are extremely important, but it's not obvious if you're not a tax scholar or you haven't been a tax lawyer for 20 years why it's important. So making it clear, especially making it clear in the introduction and the abstract, I think is the key to successfully publishing in niche fields.
Yeah, now there is an old article called Tax and lots of other, in parentheses, scholars need not apply. And it's an empirical study of the topics published in law reviews. At least traditionally, I think it's been more than just a perception. There's bias towards subjects that the students are interested in, and they've all taken the first year curriculum, so they're all familiar with those common law areas.
I will say for ILJ this past year, we actually took in a lot of tax articles at first. We had 3 tax articles, and those were some of our first articles. So we stopped looking at them later on, but they were pretty quickly placed with us. One thing too with tax, and that I utilized a couple times as the EAE, is we had one particular article that was really well written and my editors really liked it, but some of their comments were, this doesn't seem new, this doesn't seem novel. So I sent it over to Professor Lederman to get her advice on it. And that helped that article eventually become part of volume 97 for us. So again, showing in your abstract why it's new and novel can help put you over the edge to get to that next step of confirming with scholars.
I think that there can be a great interaction when law review editors come to the faculty for that kind of feedback within their area of expertise.
That's a great segue into the kind of semi-peer review that we're increasingly seeing in law reviews, right? Is that something that the ILJ frequently does?
I use it a couple of times, particularly for tax pieces, antitrust, and various things that I didn't have much, if any, experience at the time. So it isn't a standard practice for us, but it's definitely something I was encouraged to utilize.
In the abstract or the piece itself, one of the things that may really jump out right away is the title. So how important, Abbi, do you find the article title in the selection process?
I think a good title could definitely pique my interest, but for our practice, I did make it a point to open every single article that was submitted and read through the abstract. So I think the abstract was more important than title, but title could definitely give you a strong edge.
So there's a perception among professors that shorter titles are better and that punny titles or titles with colons in them are totally verboten. Is that your intuitive reaction too, Abbi?
Yeah, I didn't really love any like punny titles or ones that were super duper long, but I did definitely like some that were unique in how they presented it or made an uninteresting topic seem really cool. Like we had one piece titled Taming Unicorns, which brought me into reading the abstract, and we ended up taking on that piece. Law reviews want to keep their ranking, and one way that we keep our ranking is how often our articles are cited. So having a title that would bring in readers that might use that article in the future could be really beneficial for a law review. So keep that in mind as well.
Are there other things that you look for in articles that you think are, well, this piece is more likely to be highly cited?
We look into the methodology that an author used. If the article contains statistics or interdisciplinary methodology, it's more likely to be cited. So that is something we definitely consider in picking articles.
So you mean citable statistics, because there's definitely impressions among empiricists that it's difficult to get hard empirical articles published in top journals, but maybe that's not true anymore.
I think there's a balance there too, in having the data and having that will help drive traction, while also having a topic that's interesting and readable. So having the balance of those two, I think, can really help you succeed.
So Abbi, does it matter to you if the abstract is included in the same document as the rest of the article or as a separate document?
So Scholastica actually is a homepage section where before even clicking into any documents, I have a copy of the abstract. So that's where I use it to screen.
What about other aspects of the formatting of the article? Like, does it matter to you whether the article has a table of contents, how many footnotes the article has, what the condition of those footnotes looks to be, or anything else about the organization or structure of the article?
Yeah, so there's a few different points there. For ILJ in particular, it's really important that we get a Word document version instead of a PDF, because that allows us to plug it into our shell to see how many pages it will be in our publishing medium. Number two, we generally like to stick with about a 70 to 30 ratio for footnotes to text.
70 footnotes, 30 text.
Yeah, 70%. Yeah, we've gotten a few that were 50-50 with that. It was kind of crazy, but 70% text and 30% footnotes. So if you have a lot of footnotes that are like pretty dense, maybe lighten those up a bit, but that could just be an ILJ preference as well. Table of contents are generally preferable, but those aren't huge factors for us. We're more worried about the content, the length, and that we have the Word document version so we can check it against our own unique formatting.
What kind of length are you generally looking for?
So we look for words, and we accept larger articles and smaller articles, but I would say a good range would be between like 20 to 28,000 words, including footnotes.
So I had understood from the ILJ editors that you put it in the formatting to see the book pages, that you're less concerned about the word count and you're more concerned about how many book pages it takes up, and that you tend to prefer shorter articles so you can accept more of them to potentially get more sites. Is that correct?
Yes, pages are more important to us than the word count. The word count gives us a more accurate gauge. We had a pretty large variety of articles. We had a few very short articles and one very, very long article that I asked the author to cut down as a condition of acceptance. So having that middle range could put you in the best spot. At the beginning of the cycle, you have probably a little bit more flexibility with that. And towards the end of cycle, it depends more on how many pages we have left to fill.
How important is blue booking and having a clean blue booked article to you?
That was one of the things I really prioritized. And for my election campaign for EAE, I promised associates that we would really prioritize the quality of blue booking and grammar within the articles, because that really takes a big burden off of our associates when we're going through and publishing them.
Professors can potentially benefit from, for example, hiring a research assistant to blue book the footnotes before submitting the article.
The better shape your article's in, the less associate power we're going to need for it. So that is a really strong factor in your favor.
Pro tip for those who aren't familiar with blue booking, I now actually use Mendeley, which I think is controversial, but there are alternatives to automatically format my footnotes, which, even though I like blue booking, saves a ton of time, because also if you have a lot of supras, it'll organize your supras. It's just very easy. There isn't a default blue book format with the software. I actually have one that I created that's on my personal website.
Oh, awesome.
What about incomplete footnotes, Abby? So I think there's sort of two varieties. One is the sparsely footnoted article or sparsely footnoted section in the article, where maybe you're looking at it and thinking, there's maybe not as much support here as I would have expected. There's that. And then the second issue is footnotes that are obviously incomplete, like there's a note to self in the footnote. How do you react to those two situations?
So I think both of those might detract a little bit from your holistic review of the article. We would like to ideally see a well-cited, well-thought-out article, but we also keep in mind that we're looking in the spring, and our first read-through of the article is not going to be until the summer. So if it's an article that I feel really strongly about or is an exceptional article, we might make an offer to the author and say, we will accept your article on the condition that you fill out this part with more data. So it's something that we can address, but if it's another thing cut against you, it might detract from us making an offer.
Abby, why don't you walk us through what you expect to see in a Scholastica submission in terms of which documents typically are there?
Sure. So the main thing we see is the abstract, and that kind of fills up the main page when we click on the link to your article. And then we will also see the PDF and or Word version you submit of the entire article, the CVs of the authors, and sometimes they'll include a cover letter as well.
How valuable is the cover letter to you?
For me, I didn't utilize the cover letters too much. I mostly relied on the abstract and the content of that. If I was a little bit confused about the significance of it, sometimes I would point to the cover letter, but I would say that was the least important of all the documents I mentioned.
Do you think it's helpful if you submit a cover letter to have particular content in that letter, like things that point to the importance of the article and or how well cited the author is, for example?
Yeah, so I would really use the cover letter in a way different to your abstract, but still remembering who your target audience for the submission is. So having the information that a law review would value, like how cited you are, your expertise, or really honing in on why this topic is unique and important can be great, but don't just repeat your abstract because at that point it's just redundant.
And what do you do with the author's CV?
So there's a couple things we do with that. One, we like to have a variety of authors. So we do like to have some very well-published authors that are experts in the field. So we will look to see their publishing history, where they're teaching. ILJ does not really accept any student manuscripts, and we limit the amount of practitioner manuscripts we will consider. So that's something we look to. And then we also look to the content of the article and how that compares to what they have published before, because it establishes some expertise in what they're talking about. As an editor looking through CVs, having an article as lead article really made no difference. It was more where you were publishing and what you were publishing that affected my decision. However, some authors did feel really strongly about the placement of their article.
Typically, I hear that the CV that you should send to a law review should be shorter than like a senior professor's full CV. Do you have views on the length of CV that you would like to see with an article submission?
So I think that good middle ground is great, because if we can see you've published a lot, that really helps you out. But we don't necessarily need to see everything, because in a 20-page CV, sometimes your most important stuff will get lost. And then another thing, if you have multiple authors for the article and you have long CVs, attach those separately so we're not missing out on the other CV as we're kind of scrolling through that.
Let's talk expediting. So as folks probably know, a frequent way that you get your article read with a little bit of priority is that you have an offer to publish from somewhere, and then you tell other journals that you would like to publish with about the deadline that the first place gave you, and you ask them to expedite your submission. Now, there are ethical questions about the games people play around that. Abby, I was wondering if you had any thoughts on those.
Sure. So expedites can be a really useful tool for you to get looked at, or they can also be used to your detriment sometimes. So use them cautiously. So one way that you can really successfully use your expedite requests is tailor them towards the law journals that you really want to target. So if you get a blanket request, it might not pique your interest as much as getting a tailored request saying, I would really like to publish in your journal for these reasons. That might make me take a more serious look at sending that to my editors quickly, because we do get so many expedite requests on top of the submissions that we do need to kind of tier those in a way too.
Do you consider submissions that do not have an expedite request? Right.
Yes.
And does that change as you go through the cycle?
I think that changes as you go through the cycle. I made it a goal to go through so many pages a day, and sometimes I would look at what ones had upcoming expedite requests, and sometimes I would look at new submissions. So it really varies, but having the expedite requests definitely can get us to take a quicker look at your piece.
So the temptation, I think, that a lot of especially junior faculty may face, or advice that they might get, is that, well, in order to move up in priority, you really need to have an offer on the piece. So the advice might be send to some that you're confident will accept it. And that gets into the question of, should you ever submit to a law review that you know that you wouldn't accept the offer, even if it was the only offer that you got? Why don't we hear from you, Abby, on what that's like from the student perspective?
I think when we see that an author has chosen not to accept an offer they were given and continue with the process, it definitely leaves a bad taste in our mouth. It makes us question whether, if we give your article the precious resources of our editor's time, if you're going to take that seriously. So it might be more worth our time to consider authors who aren't doing that.
So if the submitting author says, I have this deadline from the Western Journal that nobody's heard of, hey, please meet my deadline from the Western Journal that nobody's heard of, and then they emailed saying, oh, I've declined, but I'm still interested in your law review, you at ILJ think, well, they might do the same thing to us.
Yeah.
I can't believe someone with that, this is news to me, the temerity. Yeah. I mean, I'm with Leandra. I think it's unethical to submit somewhere where you wouldn't accept if it was the only offer. That said, I think some people are doing this. I mean, especially probably junior faculty, but what you just described seems next level.
It was very, very common in the last cycle.
There's a law review article on this that's done in the form of a hypothetical dialogue where the author is totally stringing them along. And it's basically this ethics sort of story as I remember it. I think it's different, by the way, if sometimes you have junior faculty in a situation where they're on a tenure clock, they're time pressured because of the tenure clock, they're time pressured with the submission window, they either feel or get some advice that they need to submit an article immediately. And sometimes what happens with these early articles is they have not been well vetted. And what may end up happening is that they're simultaneously getting it vetted. They get feedback while it's being considered that, hey, you omitted a whole line of literature or something, or you're really wrong on this particular issue. Maybe they get an offer, but they decide to pull the piece because they want to actually make it substantively right or substantively better. I think that's different. That's new information.
There's an obvious difference between those situations too. You can tell in like the way they are presenting it. I had one author who we really loved their piece and they're like, we're not ready to publish it yet. We want to make it better. And they came back to us later and we're taking it on next year. And there's a genuineness that you can pick up on. And I think that's one thing you need to consider as well, is how genuine and kind are you being to these student editors who are running this and in school for full time. So kindness can really take you a long way. If you reach out and you're genuine, you're likely to get a better response.
I have heard that some journals have a list of people that they found so unprofessional that they will not consider their articles in the future.
And another thing too is the inverse of that. If professors are really kind and really genuine, and maybe this volume isn't the right volume for their piece, that's also something we take record of this professor was really enjoyable to work with, is really kind. Keep an eye out for their pieces next time. I had a few authors that were passed down to me to look out for, and I collected a few names this year as well.
I wanted to ask Abbi how you react to expedite requests that are from a specialty law review rather than the general law review at that school.
I don't know how much of a difference that makes. I think if it's a journal closely ranked to our journal, that might be something we speed up the process on a little bit, but we get inundated with expedite requests that the actual journal that it comes from doesn't make as much of a difference.
Oh, that's interesting, because professors believe that there's like a complicated strategy you need to follow. Like you expedite from like the 50th ranked journal to the 30th ranked journal, but no further. And it sounds like it doesn't really matter.
Yeah, I think there is some weight to having a higher ranked journal, but when we have hundreds of expedite requests at a time, it doesn't make that huge of a difference to us.
And in terms of the ranking, you're relying on the Washington and Lee Law Journal rankings?
Yes.
And is there a particular version you're using?
We use the most recent year with all of the data included.
The combined score?
Yes.
Which, if I remember correctly, places Minnesota really highly, so it must be true.
Yeah. And there are quite a few surprising ones in there that are ranked much higher or much lower than the US News. So I became very familiar with the Washington and Lee rankings when I began the process, so I could evaluate the CVs better and the relative offers and things like that.
I've heard the same thing as Leandra. The standard advice for law professors is follow the US News rankings, probably because law professors don't in general pay that much attention to rankings, and probably they're both roughly right. And if you're like in the same band with either of them, then, you know, probably to other professors, nobody cares. Like, you know, Minnesota's good, Iowa's good, Indiana's good. It's all the same to me. I don't know their specific rank.
It also might surprise you too that both Notre Dame and Fordham are ranked above UVA's Law Journal. So
I've published in both of those.
Yeah, Notre Dame is ranked number 7, Fordham is ranked number 18, and Virginia is ranked number 19. So it really varies a lot from the US News and World Report.
John, could you advise a junior person that they should accept Fordham or Notre Dame over UVA? I couldn't do it.
I don't think so. Yeah.
The branding of UVA is
Yeah.
so strong that I
Mhm.
think that people would be like, oh, that's top 10. If other law professors are looking at your CV
Yeah.
to decide whether to give you a visitorship or hire you, are they going to know that?
Yeah,
Like,
I
there's
think
this-
that is the right advice. I think you're right. Yeah.
If you're using it for prestige with other law professors,
Yeah.
I think focusing on the US News is better. But if you're using it as a stepping stone to get published with law journals in the future, it might be smarter to do Washington and Lee journal rankings because that's what we're looking at.
So when I was on a law journal not too long ago, it was a journal that reviewed articles blind. And I think this is becoming increasingly common, as is getting semi-peer review by, sending articles out to other professors. And hopefully there's a little bit less gamesmanship and attention to letterhead. Although I think it still creeps in little ways, like if you ask a professor to look at an article and the professor was already familiar with the article, it would suggest that it's one that's within the community. So there are things like that. But it seems like the main difference is just in timing, because when you review blindly, you have fewer filters that you can use on articles. You have to read all of them very closely. It seems like the blind review journals just take longer. And so some people suggest submitting to them a week or two earlier. Some of them open a week or two earlier. So that may be a useful approach with those kinds of law journals.
John, have you ever done exclusive submission?
I always do exclusive submission. So Harvard, Yale, and Stanford at least have this process where they say submit to us exclusively a week or two before you submit to other journals. A trade secret is that you can submit to all three of them and just say I'm submitting to all three of you, so you don't necessarily have to pick one. Although recently when I've done that, Stanford at least had said, okay, well, we're not going to read your article then. So it semi-works. It seems like it may vary year to year. So just this past year, for the first time, I heard of a professor at one school asking a professor at another school to recommend the article of the first professor to the law review at the second professor's school. And I had never heard of this before. I don't think it's common. Abby, is this something you've experienced?
An unsolicited request is not something I've experienced. I would have probably felt a bit uncomfortable if another professor had out of the blue come down and said something like that.
The New York Times ethicist has answered a question about this and pointed out some of the obvious problems with this issue in the context of that power dynamic. I also think there's an equity issue there that you have, where some people might be more in the club than others, right?
Purely unethical. I mean, if someone asked me to do it, I would say no. I guess it's also questionable whether it's ethical, unsolicited, for a professor who genuinely really likes an article to go to a law review editor and say, hey, would you consider publishing this?
The way I look at it is the awkward part with the law review occurs when the professor goes to the law review editor and asks for a special look of somebody else's piece. It's slightly better if that person is doing it because they actually genuinely think the piece is great, as opposed to they're just trying to do a favor for a friend, but the effect on the law review student is the same.
The editor-in-chief sent me that post and we had a talk about it and how we didn't particularly like it, especially if a professor has control over your grades. A grade can mean a lot in being balanced against other people. But I think using students can put not only the student in a bad position, but the people around that student in a bad position.
That's a great point, that it's not even just the student who was approached by the professor, but they may have to bring the article to the board or to another member of the journal.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the tricky parts of the submissions process is that sometimes you'll receive an offer to publish with a deadline on it, and then you're still under consideration at other schools, and you have to see maybe can that deadline be extended, you expedite it to the other schools. Abby, could you give us the law review editor perspective on what it's like to give that deadline and sometimes have professors trying to negotiate extensions.
Negotiations and extensions are par for the course and they happen very frequently, but there's a broad range in how they happen. I think one, transparency and kindness and being genuine can all really help you in getting that extension. So blanket asking for repeated extensions might not get you very far, but if you have an offer at one journal and are under consideration in another, be honest with the journal. Say, I am under consideration at this journal. I would really like to hear back from them. Can you extend it? And there can be some wiggle room in there. So if you're willing to give a little bit, you might get a little bit more. So for example, if you're really hoping for this one journal, maybe you could offer to withdraw from your other submissions, and that could be really valuable and show your genuine interest in publishing with the journal.
So time becomes a really important currency in this process. And there are sometimes some really heartbreaking moments for professors. I've certainly had this where it's like, if I only had a couple more days, I've gotten to board review at a couple of great journals, and I just have to decline them because I have a really good offer that's expiring and I'm just never going to get to play out the process. Back when I started publishing, the general time frame that was given was usually 2 weeks. Nowadays, I have found in more recent years that usually the deadline is typically 1 week. And I've certainly gotten some that are shorter. Is that not what you're finding, John?
Well, so there's an agreement among some journals to allow at least 1 week. And then I guess it's like the tier right below those journals that has the shortest deadlines, it seems like. Like UVA is the one where they want you to accept or return it down on the phone. And I've published one with NYU too, and they gave me 2 hours. So,
Abby, can you give us an idea of how much time in general you might give to an author?
I think it really varies based on a particular author's publishing record and how much negotiating power that author may have. It also depends on where we are in the publishing process. It can depend on if we have 2 really similar articles and we chose one, but we have an upcoming deadline on the other one. So there's so many factors that go into it. I would say between a week to 2 weeks, maybe a little bit standard, but it can really vary from there.
It's a 2-sided process, and the students want to get the articles, and they also know that the more time they give you, the more time that you have to kind of play out opportunities with other journals, and the more likely they are to potentially lose the piece.
Yeah, I would typically give out about a week, knowing I could extend it a little bit, but knowing that I would be asked for an extension in most situations. So giving myself some wiggle room. And then at the end of the semester, when we only had 3 or 4 slots to fill, making those deadlines shorter.
you know, one thing that junior professors that I know often wonder about is because students' time is so limited and you receive so many submissions, it's hard to, take a look deeply at all of the things that come in front of you. If a professor had not an acceptance, but a board read or like a second round consideration or something at some other journal, would that be enough to encourage you to take a closer look at it?
I was highly encouraged to look at board reads with caution.
Okay.
I think journals that are similarly ranked to ILJ typically don't have that board read process. It's typically at the top tier of journals, which may be more your experience with it. We only had a full board decision if we were giving a special promise, like a promise for lead article or publication in a certain issue.
How otherwise do you pick order of the volume?
The order of the volume is a very intensive process that we want to make sure we don't have too many of the same type of articles. We want to stay within a certain page count. There's a whole variety of factors that we want to make sure we have a nice diverse volume with each issue. We did make an offer for a lead article for a piece we were super excited about. It was one of our best submitted articles of the year. So as an offering of showing that author that we really love their piece, we offered to them at the beginning, we would like to make you a lead article. So I think that was a special gesture, even if it didn't mean much in the long run. But we typically don't like to make promises on placement because it gives us the flexibility to make each issue very well-rounded. Just like a final note on just making sure you're treating the editors with respect and kindness is something you should really take away from this. There are a lot of factors that go into it, but the way you treat editors has a lasting impact as well.
Thanks so much, Abbi and John, for joining us today on Break Into Tax to talk about how you optimize your law review submission.
Thank you. I learned a lot and it was a lot of fun.
Yeah, thanks for having me.